Is there a special and unique effect on the children when your father is a preacher? Nat King Cole, Sam Cooke, Marvin Gaye, Grace Jones, Aretha Franklin, they were all PKs, preachers' kids. Anita Baker was the granddaughter of a preacher. She got her musical start on the traveling preaching circuit with her granddaddy, Anita Baker. So let's start with defining the word preacher. To preach, because sometimes we think we know what these things mean. I like to hear what the dictionary says that they mean and then merge the two. To preach, to proclaim the gospel, discourse publicly on a religious subject or from a text of scripture, to deliver a sermon, one who discourses publicly on religious subjects, one whose function is to preach sermons. And I think that's a key word, function. It could be substituted for the word one whose job is to preach the word, to preach sermons. It could be that word function could be substituted for the word calling. Some people are called to preach sermons. Some people do it as a calling. Some people do it as a job. A famous sermon called The Eagle Stirreth Her Nest, Reverend C.L. Franklin. Now that sermon goes back much farther than Reverend Brother Franklin, although he certainly did his part to make that sermon famous. In fact, his 1953 recorded version of that sermon was placed into the National Registry in 2010. That's how famous that sermon became. He preached it hundreds of times in his career. That recording went into the National Registry in 2010. That said, the earliest written commentary on that sermon came from a man named Sir Charles Lyell, Lyell. He was a British national who had traveled to America, and on January 10th, 1846, he attended the first African church in Savannah, Georgia. The first African church, that's what it was called, First African Church in Savannah, Georgia, whereupon he heard Reverend Andrew Marshall preach that sermon, The Eagle Stirreth Her Nest, in 1846, before some 600 parishioners. And here's what Sir Charles Lyell wrote about Reverend Brother Andrew Marshall. This is his quote. A Negro of pure African blood with a fine sonorous voice who delivered the sermon without notes in good style. That's from an 1846 commentary on that now famous sermon, The Eagle Stirreth Her Nest. All right, brothers and sisters, so let us now turn to a book by a man named Nick Salvatore, called Singing in a Strange Land. C.L. Franklin, The Black Church and the Transformation of America. Singing in a Strange Land. C.L. Franklin, The Black Church and the Transformation of America, a 2005 book by author Nick Salvatore. Page 81. Impressed, Sir Charles Lyell recorded the structure of the sermon. Marshall spoke of the human frailty of even a pious man, and thus the need for God's grace, comparing the relationship between God and humanity, quote, to an eagle, teaching her newly fledged offspring to fly by carrying it up high into the air, then dropping it, and if she sees it falling to the earth, darting with the speed of lightning to save it before it reaches the ground, end quote. In addition to living a moral life, Marshall, quote, told them that they were to look to a future state of rewards and punishments in which God would deal impartially with the poor and the rich, the black man and the white, end quote. Author Nick Salvatore continues on page 82. As tantalizingly brief as Lyell's account is, it reveals nonetheless central aspects of an Afro-Baptist preaching tradition that would inform C.L.'s sermons a century later. First is the centrality of song. The service began with a communal hymn, and the preacher's words themselves, delivered in that fine sonorous voice, were animated, that is, sung or delivered in a rhythmic pattern. Neither the prayers nor the sermon, moreover, were written down. Reflecting the widespread illiteracy inflicted on Southern blacks, the ensuing black oral culture prized improvisation, storytelling, and verbal facility in song, sermon, and speech. This did not, therefore, mean that these sermons were delivered spontaneously. There was a great deal of careful preparation, but it did mean that the religious service itself, song, prayer, and sermon constituted a collective moment where all could participate. This call and response pattern usually framed the sermon, with parishioners reaching out verbally to the preacher, exhorting him with their vocal improvisations. In the process, worshipers were more than witnesses to a sacred ritual, for jointly with their preacher, they created the setting where they experienced their God. Even in the snippets Sir Charles Lyell recorded, the intimate play between the sacred and the secular was evident. The trust in God and the reliance on God's grace to save humans prone to sin were familiar signposts in the Christian search for rebirth and redemption. But to assume this sermon concerned only the afterlife was to miss its core complexity. As the final sentences of Sir Charles Lyell's description indicated, this was a sermon of liberation, a sermon that spoke of a spiritual transcendence with a decidedly worldly analog. What Frederick Douglass said of slave spirituals reflected many a sermon as well. Quote, "Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains." End quote. Words from the 2005 book, Singing in a Strange Land, C.L. Franklin, The Black Church, and the Transformation of America by author Nick Salvatore, or Nick Salvatore. Reverend C.L. Franklin was Aretha Franklin's father. Her daddy, Reverend C.L. Franklin, was a hugely famous social activist and progressive theologian, also known as a liberal preacher, on par with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, if you close your eyes, you might think you were listening to Reverend Brother Martin Luther King Jr. They were good friends, and they called upon one another often back in the day in their civil rights work. In fact, Aretha sang at Martin Luther King's funeral. So a word about Brother C.L., Reverend Brother C.L. C.L. Franklin was born Clarence LaVon Walker on January 22nd, 1915 in rural Mississippi to sharecropper parents, and he was raised by his mother after his biological father abandoned the family when he was 4 years old. And the following year, because back then sisters didn't wait too long back then because you needed a man and you needed hands. So the following year, his mother married a man named Henry Franklin, and the family adopted his surname. So Clarence LaVon Walker became C.L. Franklin. So there we have an unconscious father, a man who abandoned his family. And there we also have a son who grew up with the knowledge that his father abandoned the family. And also we have in this scenario a man who stepped into a marriage with a woman and her child, giving them both his last name. Two fathers, a biological father and a stepfather. So as a child, C.L. Franklin was an avid reader and writer, and he was considered as a phenomenally gifted young boy. He was baptized in the Sunflower River at age 14, and by the time he was 18, he had left Mississippi to join the traveling preaching circuit. At age 19, he married his first wife, and by age 21, he had divorced her and married Aretha's mother. Oh, wow. By 1939, at age 24, he was preaching at the New Salem Baptist Church in Memphis. And it was that same year, 1939, that 24-year-old married preacher, Reverend C.L. Franklin, fathered a child outside of his marriage with a 12-year-old girl. Now, that's not a judgment, brothers and sisters. That's a fact. After C.L. Franklin impregnated a 12-year-old child, this happened when he was preaching in Buffalo. It was a scandal, and it ran the Franklin family out of Buffalo, and that's when they went to Detroit. The mother did not come with them, or if she did come, she didn't stay long. She came for a little while, and then she left. So the mother, Aretha's mother, Barbara Siggers, Siggers, she abandoned the family. And it was a scandal. So there was no mother present in this particular scenario with Aretha. At that time, there was no mother present. The father, Reverend C.L., did take up with other women, most prominently with Clara Ward of the Clara Ward Singers. And as it turns out, guess who was pregnant when she was 12 years old? Aretha Franklin. She had her first child at 12. She had her second child at 14.